All right, U.S. history, welcome back. Hope everybody had a good weekend. Hope you're being nice to your siblings, not driving your parents crazy, and everybody staying safe. Definitely miss teaching you guys, but I hope everybody's doing well. Um, as a general statement, this class has done a pretty solid job of turning in your work. A lot of us haven't missed a single assignment, so good job with that. If you have Um, been coming up short there. I'll be reaching out to you this week, but um, good job so far, guys. So last week we talked about a topic that I really enjoy talking about, and that's the New Deal. I find FDR to be a fascinating guy, and he was certainly served as president during, well, for a long time, and during one of the most I don't know if significant is the right words, but one of the most meaningful times in modern American history. So he did a lot of things, did Roosevelt during the New Deal that worked towards resurrecting the U.S. economy. He put a lot of people to work with these various administrations he made, the Works Progress Administration, Tennessee Valley Authority, etc. And he really went a long way towards getting the country back on their feet. But, and I believe I mentioned this the first time we talked about the New Deal, what ultimately got us out of that depression was going to World War II. And that might seem counterintuitive because wars cost money, but I'm going to explain to you why that is. So, you guys know that World War One was known as the war to end all wars. You also know that it did not, in fact, end all wars. The treaty that ended World War One, the Treaty of Versailles, was very harsh on Germany. A lot of people think that through, or really, it's common knowledge that through demanding that Germany pay reparations, that they essentially disband their military, um, and that they accept complete accountability for the war. All of those stipulations in the treaty really left Germany beaten down and feeling very bitter. And that planted the seeds for World War II. So, huge reparations. Reparations is basically paying somebody back for a wrongdoing you did. Created a lot of resentment. So, the Treaty of Versailles had a few major provisions or major parts. One was the League of Nations. The League of Nations was an international peace organization. Um, Enemy and neutral nations initially were excluded from joining. So these were only allies. Germany and Russia were excluded. Germany, that makes sense, right? They had been the primary aggressor in World War One, but Russia, if you remember, for most of the war was fighting on the part of the Allies. So the fact that Russia was left out of this, I think, speaks to the pretty much immediate shift after the war from partnering with them to being very suspicious of them. And that same thing is pretty much going to happen after World War II with the Russians, where once it's over, we go from allies to basically enemies. Germany lost a lot of territory, as I mentioned. They had to return various pieces of land that they had annexed, return the Alsace-Lorraine to France, and the French border was extended. They also had to surrender all of their overseas colonies. Germany had set up colonies throughout Africa and in the Pacific Ocean. So one of the rules, one of the stipulations of Treaty of Versailles, excuse me, said they had to give all those up. It also implemented certain military restrictions. It limited the size of the German army. They were only allowed to have 100,000. They were prohibited from importing or manufacturing weapons or war material. And they were forbidden to build or buy submarines or have an air force. Their navy was also whittled down. They weren't allowed to have tanks. They could not have conscription, like a conscription policies. They couldn't draft people. And then war guild. Like I said, they had to take sole responsibility. All these things left Germany feeling like they had gotten an unfair shake. They were being mistreated. So, right about this time, the Great Depression is going on. The Great Depression means that the United States cannot give significant money to help rebuild Europe. German money was more or less worthless. Their economy was so run down that their money completely lost value, more or less. These guys here are German kids playing building blocks with stacks of German money. Well, looks like things are going to start repeating themselves because nationalism was one of the main causes of World War One. Building up of nationalism is one of the first steps towards World War Two. We see this rise of totalitarian dictators. See it in Spain, Japan, Soviet Union, Italy, and Germany. Starting at the top and going around clockwise. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin took control in 1924, and he squelches all opposition after Vladimir Lenin dies. So first it's Lenin, then Stalin's going to take over in 1924. Hitler, you guys have heard of him. He offers economic stability to unemployed Germans during the Great Depression, and he became chancellor in 1933. Hitler really made a name for himself. He got popular from giving these very fiery speeches where he talked about how Germany was being used as a scapegoat and was being punished excessively harshly. Um, Down there in Italy, a guy named Benito Mussolini rose to power in 1922. And when we first started talking U.S. history, like when we were talking about pilgrims, remember at that point, Spain and up through the 18th century, the 19th century, Italy was a pretty strong world power. Mussolini takes power with promises to the people to restore them to their former glory. Francisco Franco led the rebel nationalist army to victory in Spain, and he's eventually going to get complete control of the country in 1939. And then in Japan, Hideki Tojo became Japan's prime minister in 1941. Japan had an emperor, a guy named Emperor Hirohito. Um, After Tojo takes power as prime minister, Hirohito is still technically the king, or the emperor, but when it says he's a figurehead, that means that he still had the position, but the position didn't really carry the real power that it used to. All these guys had one thing in common. They all promised to restore their countries by bringing back jobs and promoting nationalism, really preaching to people's pride. Dictators, once they take power, are able to control and dominate the entire country. They do that by eliminating rivals, whether that be by exiling them or killing them, denying liberties, using censorship and secret police. All these abuses of power that help a dictator remain in his position. There's Lenin, the famous goatee. Stalin takes over with the famous mustache. Speaking of famous mustaches, I feel like you guys need to see this. Question is, can I figure out how to show you? Well, just take my word for it. The stash is looking awesome. I'll give you guys an update tomorrow, a full update. Let's go back. Stalin is a communist, and he's going to start taking property, farms, factories, and his sales pitch or his reasoning for that is to create equality. That's how he sold it. He had a secret police force, and there was something called the Great Purge, where Stalin went around and had a lot of his opponents jailed or assassinated. But his plans were successful. They had a lot of success. And he had something called the 5-year plan. When his 5-year plans were through, he really had uh, significantly improved Russia's place in the world. Coal production going up, steel going up, livestock at the bottom here, and 33 starts going up, as does wheat. We've talked about propaganda in a number of countries, the US being one of them, but Soviets are known especially for having these very powerful propaganda pieces. Up here, Stalin towering over a military parade. I mean, definitely sending a message of strength. Here, proud Russian soldier next to a shiny new tank. Certainly meant to evoke a certain emotion, kind of national pride. So all these dictators, these totalitarians were rising to power, but not all of them were communists like Stalin. In Italy, Germany, and Spain, they created a fascist system. Fascism, for there's a very complex definition, but for our purposes, we're just going to say extreme nationalism and limited civil liberties. Fascist governments were controlled by dictators who demanded loyalty from citizens. There's Mussolini. with the characters of fascism wheel. See, cultural, social, chief examples, basic principles, political, economic. Cultural, censorship, indoctrination, secret police. Indoctrination, it's kind of like brainwashing. Social, supported middle class, industrialist, and military. Chief examples Italy, Spain, Germany. Basic principles authoritarianism, or the leader can do whatever he wants. State more important than the individual. Charismatic leader, action oriented. Politically, they tend to be nationalist, racist, which is most famously shown by the Nazis, but it was not, they were not the only racists, just the worst. One party rule and the concept of a supreme leader. And then economic functions are controlled by state corporations or by the state. So, where communists believe that the state or the country should own the factors of production and land, fascists did not necessarily believe that. That was a primary difference between the two systems. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini's fascist party seized power by promising to revive the economy, rebuild the military, and create a new Roman Empire. The Nazis were a fascist group in Germany that wanted to overthrow the disloyal Weimar Republic. This guy, Adolf Hitler, was an early Nazi recruit and quickly rose to power in the party. Hitler had been a World War I soldier. He was a veteran of the German army. And he was one of the ones who felt like they never should have surrendered. So he was extremely bitter against leadership, the government leadership, for what, in his view, was embarrassing the country. When Hitler was first coming to power, he really looked at Mussolini as somewhat of a role model on how to establish a fascist country. This is a book called Mein Kampf, or means My Struggle. Hitler wrote it, and one of the main ideas in Mein Kampf is that Germans are, in fact, members of a master race called the Aryans, and that non Aryans were inferior, all non Aryans. So he lays out the belief that Germans are basically the chosen people. Declared that Germans needed Lebensraum, living space, and should conquer Eastern Europe and Russia. So remember, during World War One, Germany didn't have a lot of luck fighting on the Eastern Front, fighting against Russia. And as a general statement, it's not smart to attack Russia uh, on the East or on Russia's Western Front. But Hitler was a believer in doing that. He felt like basically it was the right of the Aryan people to expand their empire. And he hated the Treaty of Versailles, called it an outrage. In 33, he got a major political promotion and was named chancellor, which is essentially a prime minister. And then once he was chancellor, he parlayed that into becoming dictator. As promised, Hitler put Germans to work by building factories, highways, weapons, and increasing the military. So once he started building weapons and increasing the military, he was in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler creates the government protection squad called the SS and the secret police called the Gestapo to eliminate rivals and control all aspects of Germany. The Gestapo were known for being especially brutal. In 1935, Hitler began a series of anti Semitic laws called the Nuremberg Laws that deprived German Jews of the rights of citizens, forbade mixed Jewish marriage, and required Jews to wear a yellow star. In 1938, Hitler orders Kristallnacht, which means Night of Broken Glass. And it was essentially a mob that went through Jewish parts of town, attacking synagogues and destroying Jewish businesses. And those attacks took place all over Germany. Meanwhile, in Asia, after World War One, Japan was definitely the strongest nation in Asia, and they decided that being the power that they were at that point, they wanted to go conquer new lands. Geographically, look at the size of Japan versus the Soviet Union. So Japan decides they want to expand their empire. So that's another I, right? We've got militarism from Germany and Italy, imperialism here by both of them. Emperor Hirohito gave full control of the Japanese military to Hideki Tojo, and Tojo was military commander. So Hirohito, again, he was still royalty, but Tojo was the one who had the real power. In the 30s, you can see things are heading towards something really bad. In 31, Japan invades Manchuria. In 35, Italy attacks Ethiopia. 36, Germany occupies Rhineland. 37, Japan invades China. There's still a lot of resentment among some Chinese towards Japan for their treatment of them during this era. Um, in 38, Germany annexes Austria, and Germany takes Sudetenland. In 39, they take Czechoslovakia. 39, Italy conquers Albania. So these countries are going on a spree, taking over new lands. And by this point, Germany isn't even pretending to follow the laws of the treaty. And that's probably a good place to pause on the PowerPoint. I want to watch this as we leave for the day. It's a very short clip on Hirohito because he's not. That's not a guy we talk a lot about in U.S. history class. All of our attention tends to be on Hitler, and then to a lesser extent, others.
The U.S. has just dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities. The country is in ruins, but is still officially at war with the United States. Someone needs to call an end to this thing, make an official announcement. There's only one guy who has the moral authority to do that, to speak to the nation. One catch, he's never done it before. This is a little story about Japan's Emperor Hirohito. First, some backstory. Hirohito was born in 1901. When his grandfather, Emperor Meiji, died in 1912, Hirohito's dad, Yoshihito, became emperor. Old man Yoshihito, also known as Taisho, was never in good health, and by 1921, Hirohito had assumed most royal duties. When his father died in 1926, Hirohito became emperor. The decades before World War II were tumultuous ones for Japan, as its democratic institutions gave way to increased militarization. In 1940, with the emperor's blessing, Japan formed the Axis powers with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. After 4 devastating years, the Americans bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was here that Hirohito's leadership would truly be put to the test. Japan needed its leader, its emperor, to say something. Up until that point, he had been silent to the public. All throughout the war, he'd never been on the radio. When Hirohito finally addressed his crippled nation, he did so via a pre-recorded phonograph broadcast. This was known as the Jewel Voice broadcast, and it was the first time most Japanese had ever heard their emperor's voice. Hirohito spoke in stilted, formal language. He said, and I'm quoting, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest." That has to be one of the all-time great understatements. Japan was basically in ruins at this point. Hirohito went on to mention, "The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb." Many of Japan's World War II leaders, like Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, were brought to trial and executed for war crimes. But not Hirohito, even though he was a leader of the Japanese war machine, complicit in so much of what Japan did. The U.S. occupying forces under General Douglas MacArthur decided to keep the emperor around as a powerless figurehead. They figured Hirohito's blessing was important to the U.S. goal of rebuilding Japan as a democratic ally. All Hirohito had to do was, well, not that much. He had to disavow the belief that he, like all Japanese emperors, was descended from the gods, which he did. Still got to live in the palace, though. Sometimes it's good to be emperor. Hirohito's reign outlasted the war by over 40 years. He saw a lot happen to Japan during that time. We're talking the rise of the Japanese automobile and consumer electronics industries, Godzilla movies, and the creation of the Japanese baseball league. When he died in 1989, Japan had become the second largest.
We'll pause there, but yeah, Hirohito. He's not he's a fascinating guy, and we'll talk more about him once we get to Pearl Harbor and ultimately the dropping of the atomic bombs. But um, we're just about out of time. Let's go through. We'll finish this out. Why don't we? So in Italy, Mussolini begins his campaign to expand the Italian Empire. First thing he does is invade Ethiopia. League of Nations, which had been formed, condemned them. They spoke out publicly against it, but they didn't stop them. They didn't send troops or anything. And when Germany saw that Italy and Japan were able to do pretty much what they wanted to without the League of Nations really doing anything, that made them feel like they could take bigger steps themselves. By 36, he expanded the German military and moved troops into the Rhineland. 38, annexed Austria, invaded Czechoslovakia. Initially, the League of Nations takes an approach called the appeasement approach. They didn't want to go to war again. As much as the U.S. didn't want to be involved in another world war, that was really doubly so for these European nations, because they knew that if there was a war, it would happen right on their doorstep. So, with that, we'll stop for the day, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow.